you. Hello from LA.
I wish I was there, but so don't wish I was there at the same time.
No, it's terrible.
So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to quickly set up the screen recording, and then we'll start the interview if that's all good.
Awesome.
Perfect.
Easy.
So first I just want you to introduce yourself and then what your main focus is as an artist.
Okay, my name is Abdullah. I'm an artist that works across a whole lot of different mediums, but probably mostly painting. And my main focus is sort of looking at alternative narratives and challenging some of the narratives that exist already.
How did you get started in the artist practice and how you became an artist yourself?
I was pretty lucky that I'm the youngest of three brothers who all studied art at university. So by the time I studied it, it was pretty easy for me to get into it. And I was also very fortunate to get a scholarship in high school at a special arts high school in Perth.
Oh, I should mention, actually, with that last question, I didn't think I was going to
be an artist from any of that. It wasn't until I was 2.5 years into a journalism degree that I picked up an elective in art and switched over. The journalism certainly helped me with my writing and I guess with my communicating and the way that I approach image making.
Who are your biggest influence? Because obviously you're one for us. Who are your biggest influences?
So two of my biggest ones, conceptually, especially in Australia, are Richard Bell, who is a mentor of mine. He's an artist from Queensland in a collective called Proper Now, but also like my favourite artist in the country. And then the other big influence is Tracy Moffat, another Indigenous artist who is a rock star and does amazing stuff, and her approach to art making is really inspiring. But then on like a technical level, like it depends on the medium. So like in painting, I look at artists like Jenny Saville and Neo Rock, and like in photography, I look at a lot of science fiction and horror films. I kind of look, it comes from everywhere.
Going off that, I do notice that you obviously have your strengths in your photography and you said painting as well. How do you merge the two when you're doing it? Because you know how a lot of artists will focus on one medium. How do you manage being able to do both?
With a lot of help. So like when I do photography, I hire people for lights, I hire a photographer. Like I've always worked with David Charles Collins, who's always been behind the camera in every one of my shoots. And sort of rely more on being a director or like a creative director to get the works done. But mind you, it's all still a little bit isolating. I isolate the different mediums in that my studio in Sydney is just for painting, and if I do photography, I'll hire someone else or I'll go to a location. With the embroideries, I do them specifically in Indonesia, so they are sort of separated, and they kind of only really cross over once they get into the exhibition space.
How have you developed your career, and like obviously what opportunities have you focused on?
Well, coming from Perth originally, it was a little bit tricky because you feel so isolated from things, and there's just not much going on there. There's not many places to exhibit and not many places to engage with other artists. So there's a small, vibrant community, but it's really hard to get out. So a couple of things that I was doing very early, is I was entering a lot of competitions, because it felt like a really efficient way to meet new artists and meet the community by just making one work and then putting it in, and then trying to do group shows and that sort of thing, and finding communities really, and joining and being part of communities, being active members of different art, like creative communities, and like also turning up for other people's shows and stuff, and just being supportive and like trying to build up together as opposed to going at it alone.
How does the process of your art making look like? Like how do you seek out inspiration, and then like kind of the steps in process, like making an artwork?
Oh, it's kind of different every time, but mostly it starts off with research, and it could be from reading. Like I read a lot of books and watch the news and that sort of thing. A lot of stuff comes from that, and from personal experience and memory and that sort of things. And it could be taking notes, or it could be doing sketches, or it could just all come out at once. It all sort of depends. Most of it sort of just up here, but that kind of shifts around a bit depending on the situation.
I watched an interview of yours with MCA, and you talked about your personal connection to your cultural background, and you talked about how you felt like you were more like orbiting around the idea of your cultural ties and watching it from the outside. So I wanted to ask, how do you connect culturally, in especially your works where it demonstrates a lot of cultural like understanding, if you feel like you're an outsider or from viewing it from the outside?
Oh, that's a kind of a trickier one, because that kind of shifts for me every year. But it's sort of like growing up, when I talk about being an outsider amongst outsiders, that sort of meant different things at different times. So like when I was like at art school, I worked at a boxing gym. And so I was too boxing for art school, but too art school for boxing and that sort of thing, just feeling like on the outside. Also being a mixed heritage, my father's white, my mother's Malay, but they're both Muslim, but it came from very different cultural backgrounds. So having family members who weren't Muslim and having family members who weren't, and that sort of experience. So always sort of being a little bit on the outside, a bit too much of the other one to be fully in one.
You did kind of briefly touch on it, but how do you think your work comments on cultural, like current social, cultural, political views?
Okay, so with my work at like, how do I put it? So up until like 2011, all I did was paint pretty pictures of my friends, and that shifted with a painting that I did of Walid Ali in the Archibald. And I'd always been politically minded and engaged, but I wasn't confident enough in my practice to do anything with it. But then when I painted Walid, it's the first time that I started to get hate mail. And it's a really peculiar experience for an artist to go through. For people like I was a complete unknown, and for people to go out of their way to find my email address or my website or whatever and contact me and say nasty things. And I was speaking to Walid himself, who encouraged me. He knew about my politics or my intentions, and he said the best way to respond is to respond creatively or respond with your strengths as opposed to just getting mad about it. So that signaled for me a bit of a confidence boost, and that allowed me to sort of start making work. So commented on culture or reacted to things a bit, and then in terms of how it reacts, that's also shifted. So initially the work, like I don't know if naively is the right word, but it was sort of like demonstrating like the positivity of like an outsider group, like we're okay. But that's shifted away from that to sort of putting a mirror up to some of the negative stereotypes, and then like putting that accusation back on to those people who have those negative feelings towards people like me. And then the work is shifted again, where now more recently it's having like most of my exhibitions, fortunately for me, but like have been overseas, and the conversation is different. So I have to speak a little bit more broadly, less Australian specific, and even like less Australian historical specific. So like in previous works where I've talked to the idea of the Cronulla riots or the protests against the mosque in Bendigo, like they can still be the reasons I make the work, or they can be like the genesis, but the outcomes have to be a little bit more broad or a little bit more open to interpretation. And another thing that I try and do now is what I'm trying to do is to get my audience to afford others the specificity and complexity that they afford themselves. So that's a step towards empathy. And so that's a little bit broader than what I was doing initially in reacting to specific historical and contemporary, like, current events.
And now trying to speak more to the heart of things, or to the underlying issues that span all of these.
Who do you see as your audience?
So this is a good question, because like I used to ask this question to when I had a radio show, and people were really it would affect people, or they'd be like set off course by it, because I'd ask them like who my work is for, and that's different to like who your audience is, I guess. Like the two separate but not mutually exclusive groups, where they're like, my audience is largely an art audience, like where by the nature of where the things are exhibited, especially in the physical space, but online it's very different. But what I'm making my work for is for that 9 to 15-year-old version of me who's in like Western Sydney or in Sunshine in Victoria or East Cannington, where I grew up in, who's just understanding and realising that their narrative and their stories aren't being represented in the mainstream. And I'm not trying to claim their experience, but there's enough of a shared overlapping experience that hopefully they can relate to what I'm saying, and hopefully help them articulate how they're experiencing the world a little bit. So that's who the work is for.
Thank you so much for taking the time out. Obviously, I know you're busy and you're doing a lot over there in LA at the moment. And all the best for your exhibition. Hopefully the coronavirus didn't ruin anything while you were there.
I think I was okay. I'm just trying to book a flight out of here.
Yeah, you just want to come home. Don't worry, we'll take you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And you have a lovely day.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.